Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Oklahoma. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1893, and the dry winds of the Cimarron territory carried dust like ground glass across the empty miles of scrub and fence posts. What little light reached the plain seemed filtered through smoke. That autumn, a woman by the name of Eleanor Bristow opened a roadside inn halfway between Boise City and Mead Creek Crossing. The sign outside read, "Bristow's Rest House," painted neatly in white, and travelers claimed the coffee was strong enough to wake a dead mule. The inn sat a mile off the main cattle road, surrounded by a low fence of mesquite and posts sunk deep into red dirt. No one remembered exactly when the building first stood there. Old maps listed it simply as structure, unknown purpose. A clerk from the Cimarron County Survey Office, Henry Lott, later testified that the foundation seemed older than the rest, perhaps left from a failed way station built decades before. Eleanor herself was quiet, mid-40s, with a narrow face and a voice that carried through wood like a nail through pine. She'd arrived from Wichita, Kansas, with her teenage son Samuel, saying little about her past. Folks described her as a fair cook and fairer listener, though a few claimed she kept her kitchen locked even when serving meals. According to an early article from the Meade County Ledger, her establishment became a haven for trail riders during long drives north. The record notes, "Mrs. Bristow provides supper and a dry cot for any honest man on the road. Fees fair, supper simple." But between the lines of those old notices lies a silence historians can't easily fill. The local sheriff's ledgers from 1894 show at least 6 disappearances in the region, all recorded within 12 miles of her inn. No one connected the pattern at first. Men often vanished on the frontier, stampedes, fevers, bad luck. Still, the details felt heavy. A ranch hand named Joseph Tern, last seen leaving Bristow's porch, a postal carrier whose route passed her road twice a week but stopped reporting, 2 peddlers selling tinned peaches. At first it was just uneasy talk. Then came a letter found years later in the county archive, written by a traveler to his wife. The woman who runs this place smiles as though she has buried every man she's ever fed. I cannot shake the feeling that something behind her eyes keeps count. Investigators decades later would cite this letter during the Cimarron Territory Review hearings, a formal revisiting of crimes that went untried in that lawless era. Even in those records, Eleanor Bristow's name surfaces like a stain beneath old ink. And it's from those faint lines, faded receipts, a half-rotted ledger, and the stories of men who rode past but did not stop, that this story begins. By early spring of 1894, the plains around Mead Creek had thawed into long streaks of mud, and travelers once again began crossing the Panhandle roads. Bristow's Rest House seemed a small comfort amid the emptiness. The lamp in the window, visible from nearly half a mile off, promised warmth and coffee to anyone willing to brave the isolation. Eleanor's neighbors were few: the Prentice family, who farmed sorghum a mile east, and Jonas Flett, an itinerant preacher known for his habit of arriving uninvited at supper tables. Flett's notes, later found among his effects by the county probate office, describe her in measured tones. "Mrs. Bristow conducts herself with a severity of manner not unbecoming to a widow. Yet I perceive she regards strangers with undue scrutiny, as though weighing more than their moral worth." Local gossip claimed her husband had died in Kansas under uncertain terms. Some said consumption, others an accident involving scalding lye. No death record was ever located in Sedgwick County, where she was said to have lived. Still, none doubted her industriousness. She kept chickens, baked her own bread, and sold preserves to passing riders. Her son Samuel often delivered them to neighboring farms, though some remembered he grew withdrawn, refusing eye contact, pale as if half sick. By midsummer, the small mysteries began. A drover from Dalhart reported that a companion of his, a young man named Clarence Doyle, had vanished after staying a night at Bristow's. They had eaten supper, beans and cornbread, then retired to separate rooms. In the morning, Doyle's horse and satchel were gone. but his boots were found under the porch steps. Mrs. Bristow, when questioned later, claimed he'd left before sunrise, headed west with a restless spirit. The constable at Mead Creek, Earl Danner, recorded the incident but admitted he lacked jurisdiction. This was still part of the Cimarron territory, a place half recognized by the federal government and patrolled by no consistent law. His brief note in the 1894 docket reads, "Matter unconfirmed. No warrant possible under current border status." That same season, a tinker's wagon overturned near the Bristow property during a rainstorm. When locals arrived to help, they found the goods salvaged: pots, tools, bolts of cloth, neatly stacked by her barn door. Eleanor said she'd gathered them so they wouldn't be spoiled, but the driver's body was never located. The rain had erased most traces, she told them, and no one argued. Months later, Reverend Flett mentioned her again in his circuit journal. "She served me coffee black as tar, and I swear the air inside that house smelled faintly of iron." The son looked on from the stairwell like one who has seen too much and dares not speak. Historians who reviewed those journals during the Cimarron Territory hearings noted how Flett's entries began aligning with the period of reported disappearances, a detail that would, decades later, bring her name back into uneasy circulation. But in 1894, the prairie winds still carried only rumors. The trail went quiet beneath the dust, and the lamp in her window kept burning. The first real account entered into record came from Andrew Collier, a railway freight agent who often traveled between Guymon and Boise City. In a deposition given years later, Collier recalled stopping at Bristow's rest house on a cold night in late October of 1894. He'd been delayed by a broken wheel and reached the inn well past dusk. "There was a smell of boiled meat," he wrote, "and something else beneath it, like burned hair or grease turned sour. The woman kept her smile but never took her eyes from me. The boy, Samuel, stayed in the corner, wiping a tin plate that already looked clean. He stayed only one night, but weeks later, Collier claimed to have found a small pocket watch among his things that did not belong to him. The initials CD were engraved on the inside lid. Likely Clarence Doyle's, the missing drover. The watch was entered into county evidence much later, though no surviving photograph exists today. Another mention appears in the Mead Creek Parish records, where Reverend Amos Pritchard noted his brief visit to the Bristow property. He'd been conducting baptisms along the Cimarron route when he stopped for water. According to his entry dated November 2nd, "The woman at the inn refused me entry, saying her lodger had taken ill and she could not risk contagion. I heard a groaning within, but she shut the door before I could speak further. Her boy stood behind the curtain, pale as parchment." Pritchard's report was forgotten until the early 1930s, when a regional historian, Dr. Wallace Keene, compiled testimonies from the Cimarron Territory hearings. Keene's papers, preserved at the Oklahoma Historical Society, draw parallels between Bristow's case and other isolated crimes in the ungoverned Panhandle, where law was as thin as the horizon. By winter, fear had begun to take root. Ranchers along the route started avoiding her road. A trapper named Hugo Sims told the Dalhart Gazette that he'd passed by the inn one evening and seen smoke from the back, thick and oily, not the kind from a stove. He claimed he smelled tallow and heard chopping long after midnight. Still, without a body or a confession, nothing could be done. When two Texas cattlemen vanished near the state line in February 1895, their trail simply ended at a fork where Bristow's fence posts came into view. Decades later, during the 1936 Federal Review of Cimarron-era disappearances, Dr. Keene cited this very region as a zone of bureaucratic blindness, referencing the Cimarron Territory's lack of formal governance. He noted that rumors of the woman innkeeper who fed death persisted long after her supposed death. But in the moment, back in 1895, the locals did what frontier folk often did with unease. They ignored it. The road remained quiet, the lanterns kept burning, and in the deep Oklahoma wind, the truth stayed buried just beneath the dust. By the summer of 1895, fear had matured into whispered certainty. Men at the trading post near Boise City began to mutter that the Bristow place was no good ground. Even teamsters who once stopped for supper chose to camp a few miles downriver, claiming the wind carried a smell not of cooking, but of curing. Constable Earl Danner, already stretched thin across 50 miles of jurisdictional gray, finally made a formal visit. His report, filed only as entry number 42, Mead Creek logbook, was written in cramped, uneven script. Property well kept. Owner evasive. Kitchen locked. Boy absent. Explained absences by claim of fever outbreak. Declined inspection on grounds of health precaution. He could not legally compel entry. Cimarron territory, still disputed, lacked an enforceable court. Danner later told a deputy that the place was neat as a ledger but felt wrong to stand inside. That same week, a rancher named Benjamin Hurst found what appeared to be personal effects along a dry creek bed half a mile behind the inn. A belt buckle, a damp notebook, and a shoe. The notebook, though mostly ruined, contained an address for a supplier in Amarillo and a single line written in careful hand. "If I should not return, look to the woman at Mead's Fork." The evidence was brought to Danner, but with no missing person claim officially filed, it was set aside. "Paper in bad shape," he wrote. "Possibly joke or trespasser. The entries end there." By late August, travelers began reporting strange noises at night, a rhythmic pounding, sometimes like a mallet, sometimes like boots on a cellar stair. Jonas Flett, the preacher, heard it himself one evening and claimed it stopped the moment he called her name. "She stepped onto the porch," he wrote, holding a lantern that shook through her hand did not. "Reverend," she said, "some doors are better left shut." That line was repeated or decades afterward in campfire retellings across the Panhandle. The next confirmed event occurred in October, when a deputy from Beaver County, crossing west in pursuit of a cattle thief, noted smoke rising from her property. He approached the inn around dawn and found Eleanor alone in her yard, burning a pile of clothing and blankets. When asked, she claimed it belonged to a traveler who died of fever the previous night, and that she was destroying the contaminated goods. No body was shown. The deputy, short on time, accepted her word and rode on. Within months, the disappearances reached 9 in number, an alarming figure even for that lawless stretch. Letters from distant families arrived at the Cimarron Survey Office, seeking word of sons or brothers who'd last been seen at the Woman's Inn near Mead Creek. Clerks logged them, folded the pages, and filed them away in boxes labeled Unclaimed Correspondence. Years later, when Dr. Wallace Keene reviewed those archives, he marked each missing man on a hand-drawn map. Nearly all lines converged on 1 square mile of prairie, the very spot once called Bristow's Rest House. And still, in 1895, the law looked the other way. The frontier had many ghosts, and no one yet guessed how many slept beneath that soil. By the summer of 1895, fear had matured into whispered certainty. Men at the trading post near Boise City began to mutter that the Bristow place was no good ground. Even teamsters who once stopped for supper chose to camp a few miles downriver, claiming the wind carried a smell not of cooking, but of curing. Constable Earl Danner, already stretched thin across 50 miles of jurisdictional gray, finally made a formal visit. His report, filed only as entry number 42, Mead Creek logbook, was written in cramped, uneven script. Property well kept. Owner evasive. Kitchen locked. Boy absent. Explained absences by claim of fever outbreak. Declined inspection on grounds of health precaution. He could not legally compel entry. Cimarron territory, still disputed, lacked an enforceable court. Danner later told a deputy that the place was neat as a ledger but felt wrong to stand inside. That same week, a rancher named Benjamin Hurst found what appeared to be personal effects along a dry creek bed half a mile behind the inn. A belt buckle, a damp notebook, and a shoe. The notebook, though mostly ruined, contained an address for a supplier in Amarillo and a single line written in careful hand. "If I should not return, look to the woman at Mead's Fork." The evidence was brought to Danner, but with no missing person claim officially filed, it was set aside. "Paper in bad shape," he wrote. "Possibly joke or trespasser. The entries end there." By late August, travelers began reporting strange noises at night, a rhythmic pounding, sometimes like a mallet, sometimes like boots on a cellar stair. Jonas Flett, the preacher, heard it himself one evening and claimed it stopped the moment he called her name. She stepped onto the porch, he wrote, holding a lantern that shook through her hand, did not.
"Reverend," she said, "some doors are better left shut." That line was repeated
or decades afterward in campfire retellings across the Panhandle. The next confirmed event occurred in October, when a deputy from Beaver County, crossing west in pursuit of a cattle thief, noted smoke rising from her property. He approached the inn around dawn and found Eleanor alone in her yard, burning a pile of clothing and blankets. When asked, she claimed it belonged to a traveler who died of fever the previous night, and that she was destroying the contaminated goods. No body was shown. The deputy, short on time, accepted her word and rode on. Within months, the disappearances reached 9 in number, an alarming figure even for that lawless stretch. Letters from distant families arrived at the Cimarron Survey Office, seeking word of sons or brothers who'd last been seen at the Woman's Inn near Mead Creek. Clerks logged them, folded the pages, and filed them away in boxes labeled Unclaimed Correspondence. Years later, when Dr. Wallace Keene reviewed those archives, he marked each missing man on a hand-drawn map. Nearly all lines converged on 1 square mile of prairie, the very spot once called Bristow's Rest House. And still, in 1895, the law looked the other way. The frontier had many ghosts, and no one yet guessed how many slept beneath that soil. By autumn of 1896, the Bristow disappearance had hardened from rumor into a kind of rural scripture, told in half-whispers around fires and trading posts. No one saw her leave, yet all agreed she was gone. What lingered was her house, standing silent beneath a bruised Oklahoma sky, windows boarded but never entirely dark. Ranchers claimed a faint glow still seeped through the slats at night. Constable Earl Danner, though stripped of formal authority after the marshal's office collapse, returned to the property once more. In his private journal, found years later among his widow's things, he described the scene with a weary precision. No sound, the yard left in haste, bread still cooling, though months cold. It is a place where time went wrong. Chickens starved in their pens, yet the stove remains clean. He noted again the pit behind the smokehouse, now refilled and leveled. He considered reopening it, but lacked men willing to dig. The Prentice family, her nearest neighbors, had moved east after losing livestock to disease, and the road itself was all but abandoned. By winter, strange stories began spreading. A passing tinker swore he'd seen a woman fitting Eleanor's description serving food at a way station near Fort Supply, though no record of her employment exists. Another account from a railroad cook near Woodwood claimed she appeared at his campfire asking if he kept good knives, then vanished when the men turned to fetch her water. Newspapers in Guthrie and Wichita printed short blurbs. Missing woman of Cimarron territory believed to have fled south. And later, rumors of skeletons exaggerated. Both articles relied on hearsay. No reporter visited the site. But locals kept their own record. A cattle foreman named Harvey Binns told a schoolteacher that his men heard hammering near the old inn long after it was empty. No wind made that sound, he said, while it had a rhythm like building, or burying. By 1897, the inn's roof collapsed in a storm, and the land was claimed by a new settler under the Homestead Act. He lasted 3 months. In his withdrawal notice to the county surveyor, he wrote simply, "Soil unhealthy, dreams worse." When Dr. Wallace Keene compiled his review decades later, he noted these successive departures, calling them a human barometer of unease. Keene also cited references from the Cimarron Territory records, emphasizing how little oversight existed in those border years, a haven for outlaws, and perhaps for crimes like hers. In an 1898 dispatch, one final letter reached the sheriff's office in Beaver County, written in uncertain hand. "I have seen the boy. He is grown now and travels under another name. He carries a ring that was mine once." The letter was unsigned, and the file ends there. Thus, the case of Bristow's Rest House drifted into the gray edges of history, part fact, part echo. Those who passed that way in later years said even the grass grew uneven where the inn once stood, as if the ground itself remembered what men preferred to forget. The turn of the century brought new settlers, rail lines, and with them a brief revival of interest in the abandoned Bristow property. In 1902, a team of surveyors working on a proposed wagon route toward Beaver County stumbled upon the ruins. The foundation stones remained intact, the smokehouse half standing, its door rusted shut. Among the crew was Professor Alton Greaves, a lecturer from the Territorial Normal School at Alva, who joined to document forgotten settlements. Greaves's field notes, preserved in the school archives, describe the site with a detached, scientific tone. The inn's footprint measures 22 feet by 28, of mixed oak and mesquite, the hearth intact, still stained by some resinous material, soil dense with ash, found fragments of crockery, one broken teapot, 2 buckles, and a child's comb. One laborer unearthed what he thought was animal bone from near the smokehouse. Greaves catalogued it simply as unidentified mammalian remains, but later correspondence suggests he suspected otherwise. In a letter to his colleague Dr. T.C. Mallory, he wrote, "I cannot say with certainty these are human, but the density and curvature tell a story best left unread." Local newspapers revived the legend briefly, calling it the Cannibal Inn of the Cimarron. The phrase horrified Greaves, who insisted he'd found no proof of human remains. But folklore thrives where facts hesitate. Soon, curious riders came from Gaimon and Dalhart, pocketing bits of brick or wood as souvenirs. Meanwhile, an aging Jonas Flett, by then half-blind and living with relatives near Perryton, Texas, gave a final statement to a visiting journalist. His words, printed in the Panhandle Tribune in 1904, still carry that rural cadence of conviction. She was not mad, only careful. I reckon she did not see it as killing but keeping. Some people keep things, you know, to feel they still own something, even souls. It's unclear whether Flett spoke from faith, guilt, or rumor, but his phrasing found its way into sermons, campfire tales, and the growing corpus of stories surrounding Eleanor Bristow. By 1907, the newly admitted state of Oklahoma began an initiative to consolidate territorial records. Many old county boxes were burned or discarded to save storage. Among them were portions of the Cimarron Marshal's office archive, including, historians believe, Dana's original field log and Bly's testimony. Only fragments survive, retyped decades later by Dr. Wallace Keene, whose fascination with the case never waned. In one of his annotated margins, Keene compared the Bristow story to the frontier's broader absence of order, writing, "As with the unclaimed lands of the Cimarron territory, the moral boundaries were unmarked. One woman's kitchen might as well have been a gallows, hidden by geography and indifference." By the time Greaves and his team left the site, they'd reburied most of what they'd found, marking the pit with a cross of mesquite branches. They photographed it, but the plate glass later cracked in transport, an irony not lost on Keene, who would later note, "The land resists being seen clearly." When the wind picked up that afternoon, one surveyor swore he heard knocking from beneath the soil. Greaves dismissed it as shifting frost, but the man resigned that evening, leaving his wages behind. By 1910, the Bristow site had been swallowed by prairie grass and new fence lines. Yet the story refused to die. Locals called the area the Hollow Ground. Not a name on any map, but one spoken carefully, often at dusk. Children were warned not to wander there. Ranch hands swore that compasses spun near the creek bend. That spring, a new family, the Ryders, leased the parcel unaware of its history. Thomas Ryder, his wife May, and their daughter Lydia built a modest clapboard home a few hundred yards from the old foundation. According to a statement given later to the Texas County Recorder, they began noticing strange disturbances within weeks. May Ryder's journal, a weathered notebook now housed at the Oklahoma Historical Society, tells of nights when the kitchen door swung open despite its latch, and of voices like prayer heard near the smokehouse ruins. Lydia, then 12, claimed she saw a woman's silhouette watching from the field during a thunderstorm. Thomas, skeptical, dismissed it all, until the livestock began to vanish. Neighbors helped him search, finding only torn wire and muddy depressions in the soil. One morning in June, he discovered a shallow hole behind the house, as though something had been unearthed. The next day, he ordered the ground leveled and fenced, but within a week, more holes appeared, spreading outward in a rough circle. A letter sent by Thomas to a local newspaper survives. The ground here breathes after rain. You can feel it underfoot, a slow heaving like lungs. I've dug and found nothing, but it does not stay flat. When Dr. Wallace Keene reviewed the writer correspondence years later, he considered it a psychological echo, a family haunted by folklore rather than spirits. Still, he included it in his Cimarron review papers, observing that the incidents coincided with a series of regional vanishings. 2 prospectors lost near Hoe, Ochre, a stage driver unaccounted for on the Dalhart Run, and a hired hand who left his employer's cabin claiming he'd heard knocking underground. In 1912, the writers abruptly left the homestead. Their property deed lists the reason simply as illness. When a county clerk examined the house months later, he found their furniture covered with cloth, food still on the shelves, and a child's shoe placed neatly by the window. The new land agent, perhaps unfamiliar with the legend, resold the property within the year. None of the subsequent tenants lasted a full season. Some cited sickness, others bad drainage. The locals no longer approached after sundown. In 1915, a traveling photographer named Harlan Vest attempted to capture the ruins for a feature on frontier ghost towns. His glass plate developed with streaks like long fingers across the image. The outlines of the windows warped into faces. He destroyed the negative, claiming it came out wrong. By the end of the decade, Bristow's rest house existed only in recollection and cautionary lore, a story mothers whispered to still restless children, and a warning for travelers to keep moving once darkness touched the Cimarron plain. The 1920s brought paved roads, motor cars, and a generation eager to document the vanishing frontier. Among them was Miss Clara Hensley, a young ethnographer from the University of Oklahoma, who began collecting oral histories of the Cimarron territory. In 1923, she visited the ghostly stretch near Mead Creek, unaware that the locals still refused to camp within sight of the old Bristow Foundation. Her field journal opens with restrained curiosity. Locals recount a woman innkeeper of the 1890s who fed travelers, some say, to the hogs, others to herself. Names uncertain. The soil redder than nearby tracks. Older residents lower their voices when mentioning the smokehouse. Hensley was methodical, not superstitious. She interviewed anyone willing to speak, ranch widows, survey clerks, a retired marshal from Guyman. Several mentioned Earl Danner, the former constable. Though he died years before, his daughter still kept his old journal, brittle and brown from neglect. In its pages, Hensley found familiar fragments, the letter about the pit, the partial inventory of belongings, the note about bread cooling though months cold. She wrote to Dr. Wallace Keene, who was by then near 70 and living quietly in Stillwater. Keene encouraged her to compile everything, warning that the Bristow case thrives on omission. He recalled how, during his last review of the Cimarron Territory files, he'd seen gaps where reports should have been, entire pages torn out, replaced by clean copies dated years later. History, he told her in a letter, does not forget by accident. Someone trimmed the record with purpose. In 1925, Hensley published a short essay in the Panhandle Review titled The Woman Who Fed the West. She stopped short of labeling Eleanor a murderer, instead calling her a figure born from hunger and solitude. Still, the article reignited local superstition. Horace began stopping at Mead Creek to collect soil or pose by the remnants of the fence line. That same summer, a severe storm swept through, flattening what little remained. A county inspector found that the pit behind the smokehouse had reopened, its surface eroded by rain to reveal dark, compacted soil. Inside were shards of crockery, 2 spoons, and a small locket etched with the initials E.B. The items were placed in a storage drawer at the Boise City Courthouse, later misplaced during renovations in 1931. After the storm, Miss Hensley reported recurring dreams of the inn, the sound of a cleaver against wood, and a lantern swinging in an unseen hand. She noted them clinically in her journal, but refused to return to the site. Her last entry on the subject reads, "No evidence remains, only a feeling that the land is not finished speaking." Keene cited her words approvingly in his later compilation, noting how each generation, scholars, farmers, preachers, seemed to rediscover the Bristow case as though drawn by the same unburied truth. By the decade's end, Hensley had moved east to study folklore in Tennessee. The plains went quiet again, but the story, like the wind, never truly stopped moving. When the 1930s arrived, the Great Depression pressed across the plains like a slow drought of faith. Entire counties emptied, and with that displacement came a renewed fascination with older mysteries, grim reflections of loss when the living had little left to claim. It was during this period that Dr. Wallace Keene, now frail and near the end of his career, submitted his most exhaustive review, Unprosecuted Incidents of the Cimarron Territory, 1887 to 1897. Among the 31 unsolved cases, the Bristow matter occupied an entire section. Keene described it not as a crime, but as a lingering administrative wound. He wrote that the Cimarron Territory, functioning in its day outside formal statehood, left an archive without a custodian and a silence mistaken for closure. Keene's review drew upon affidavits long forgotten in county vaults. One came from Clem Roon, the old laborer who had helped Constable Danner dig behind the smokehouse in 1896. Roon's deposition, dated 1899 and rediscovered in Amarillo, provided a rare first-hand glimpse. "We turned the soil and struck something hard, like timber or bone. Danner said not to speak of it till authority was certain. That night, I dreamed I heard the same thudding sound again, only slower, as though it knew we were listening." Another testimony, given by Foster Bly, added further unease. He claimed he saw Samuel Bristow, the missing boy, years later in Santa Fe, working under a different name at a stockyard. "He wouldn't meet my eyes," Bly wrote, and he carried a scar down his right forearm, same as before. Keene treated these accounts with cautious skepticism, yet he emphasized their alignment with the timeline of recorded disappearances near Mead Creek. The federal clerks reviewing his draft under the Oklahoma Historical Records Program noted the chilling consistency: the missing, the property, the reburied. During hearings held in Oklahoma City in 1936, officials questioned the possibility of reopening an inquiry. The proposal died within months, funding was cut, and more immediate concerns, drought, dust, poverty, overshadowed the ghosts of 1893. Still, fragments of the Bristow file began to circulate among journalists. An article in the Tulsa Tribune used the phrase "frontier nightmare," borrowing directly from Keene's own marginalia. It described Eleanor Bristow as an innkeeper who turned the hunger of the plains upon itself, a line so striking it later became the shorthand title for the entire case. Shortly before his death in 1938, Keene revisited the territory one last time. A younger assistant accompanied him and later recorded that Keene stood for an hour by the collapsed foundation without speaking. Only when the wind shifted did he murmur, "The ground here knows more than any living witness." He returned to Stillwater and died 2 months later, leaving behind boxes of notes labeled "incomplete." Many were lost in a small office fire the following spring. What survived were carbon copies, fragments of maps, and a single typed line that scholars still debate. There is no proof she killed anyone, only that she cooked for them and none was seen again. The remark would echo across decades, feeding the story's uneasy endurance, a case neither proven nor forgotten, sealed beneath the dust of bureaucracy and time. The 1940s brought war abroad and quiet abandonment at home. The Oklahoma Panhandle, always a hard country, grew emptier still. Farms failed, schools closed, and the younger generation left for cities or service. What remained were long roads, half-buried fence lines, and stories too stubborn to die. The Bristow tale was one of them. Following Dr. Wallace Keene's death, his surviving notes passed to the Territorial Museum Committee in Stillwater, where they sat largely untouched. The boxes contained brittle pages, maps drawn in pencil, witness names repeated with small variations, and 2 envelopes marked Cimarron Mead Crossings. One held a faded photograph, the Bristow property, taken from a distance, the chimney still standing amid weeds. On its back, Keene had written, 1893, Oklahoma. She cooked what the land provided. Locals who remembered the old stories rarely used her name now. To them she was simply the woman at Mead's Fork. Older ranch hands claimed the land was unlucky. Tools left overnight rusted faster there, they said, and animals refused to graze near the old smokehouse mound. A traveling preacher in Guyman, Reverend Ellis Boone, noted in a sermon, "There are places where sin has weight, where the earth itself does not forgive. I have walked such ground." During the war years, a handful of soldiers returning home passed through the Panhandle by rail. One of them, Private Lee Moncrief, wrote a letter to his sister describing the view from the window. "There's a stretch of land between Boise and Meade that looks scorched. No trees, no birds. The men say a woman once fed travelers there and then buried them in the mud. I don't know if it's true, but I swear I saw a shape by the ruins as we passed, not moving, just standing in the rain." That letter, later donated to a veterans' archive, rekindled faint curiosity. Yet official interest never returned. Ned. The Depression had erased too many local records, and those who might have remembered were dead or scattered. The land fell to auction, divided into grazing parcels no one wanted. In 1944, the Oklahoma Geological Survey conducted aerial mapping of the region. The resulting photos show faint rectangular discolorations in the soil, as though something once buried had settled unevenly. Analysts dismissed them as natural variances, but in the margin of one print a technician had scribbled, "Odd symmetry near smokehouse site, possible foundation void." The following year, a small grass fire swept through the Mead Creek Basin, uncovering a portion of old fencing and the cornerstones of the inn. A local youth, Roy Fenton, took a photograph before authorities arrived. The image, grainy and washed by wind, shows the faint outline of a doorway and what appears to be a cooking pot half buried in soot. No excavation followed. The site, briefly exposed, was soon forgotten again under a season of rain. Still, each generation seemed to leave a mark, intentional or not, a line in a notebook, a rumor carried through dust. The silence after Keene's death wasn't complete. It simply changed tone. The story sank deeper, no longer a matter of law or record, but of uneasy remembrance whispered whenever someone new passed the empty ground and asked what once stood there. By the early 1950s, Oklahoma was rebuilding. Roads were paved where wagon ruts had been, and small towns began courting tourists with tales of their frontier past. It was during this revival of regional pride that Bristow's Rest House quietly re-entered public conversation, not through scholars or officials, but through storytellers. A columnist named Eugene Harcrow, writing for the Boise County Gazette, published a Sunday feature titled Legends of the Cimarron Trail. Among stories of gunfighters and cattle thieves, he included a brief paragraph on an unnamed woman innkeeper, said to have served the dead to the living. The phrasing, likely borrowed from oral tradition, sparked a flurry of letters. Some readers insisted the tale was old fiction. Others claimed distant relatives had known the Bristows personally. Harcrow followed up with a second article the next month subtitled The Inn with No Guests. He referenced the earlier reports of Dr. Wallace Keene, citing the Cimarron territory as a gray zone where record and rumor coexisted. To illustrate the point, he quoted an unnamed rancher. "My daddy said the ground out there still smells of lye when it rains, and no grass grows higher than your boot heel." The newspaper enjoyed its highest circulation in years. Soon, radio hosts in Woodward and Amarillo began mentioning the frontier nightmare during late-night storytelling segments. One program dramatized the events with fictional dialogue. A woman humming as thunder rolled over the plains, the creak of a cellar door, the clatter of pans. For older residents, the renewed attention was unsettling. Reverend Boone, now retired, wrote a letter to the editor cautioning against turning tragedy into theater. He warned that those who stir the ashes of sin may find the embers still warm. The paper printed his note beside an advertisement for a new diner open. Along Route 83. Ironically, the publicity drew curious travelers to the area. Weekend motorists came looking for the ruins, guided only by vague directions. Turn left past the windmill. Keep going until the road stops pretending to be a road. Many found nothing. Some found too much. One couple reported hearing rhythmic knocks under their car tires when they parked near the creek bed. Another visitor claimed their camera jammed each time they aimed toward the field. In 1954, a local teacher named Martha Elgin self-published a small booklet titled Echoes of Mead Creek. It mixed folklore with transcribed interviews, including one with a surviving grandson of Constable Danner. He recalled his grandfather's haunted expression whenever the Bristow case was mentioned. He said there are crimes you can't bury deep enough because the ground wasn't built to forget. Elgin's booklet sold modestly, but reached university libraries across the state. For the first time in decades, the Bristow name entered academic indexes again, footnoted beside other territorial mysteries. The story, half myth and half document, had taken on a new identity. Not a case to be solved, but a parable of isolation, hunger, and the slow corrosion of truth. Even so, those who lived nearest the site still avoided speaking after dark, saying the wind sometimes carried the clatter of pots, or the faint, measured rhythm of someone sharpening a blade. The 1960s arrived with optimism, television, highways, and the promise that the modern world could finally lay the old ghosts to rest. Yet in western Oklahoma, progress moved unevenly. The Bristow site, still technically unclaimed pasture land, lay just beyond a new survey for the Cimarron Cutoff Highway, and for the first time in 70 years, machinery rolled over the ground that had once held her in. Construction foreman Albert R. Coyle recorded the incident that reignited official interest. On May 6, 1962, his crew unearthed what appeared to be bone fragments of unusual density while grading a drainage ditch. A workman swore the pieces looked too small for cattle. They halted briefly, called county authorities, and waited. The responding deputy, young and unsure, bagged the remains and delivered them to the Texas County Coroner's Office in Guymon. 3 weeks later, the coroner's report classified them as animal, possibly porcine. The case was closed without notation, and the bones were sent to disposal. But according to an interview Coyle gave years later, the fragments disappeared before the report was finalized. Some man in a suit came for them, he said. Not county, not state. Said he'd been sent from Stillwater. No record of such a visit survives. Around the same time, the Oklahoma State University Archives initiated a clean-out of unclaimed personal collections. Among the discarded materials were several unlabeled boxes containing correspondence between Dr. Wallace Keene and Clara Hensley. Letters that had briefly resurfaced in the 1920s. One surviving catalog entry lists them as destroyed mold damage. If they existed today, historians believe they might have contained Keene's last notes about the missing field logs and his theories on the Bristow cellar. That summer, Boise City High School's History Club undertook a project called Ghosts of the Panhandle, interviewing elderly residents about local legends. Among the tapes, still preserved on brittle reels, one anonymous voice recounted, "My pa said the woman's boy didn't die. Said he came back for her once, years after she was gone. Folks heard knocking from under the house and found the door open in the morning. No tracks leading away." The tape ends abruptly with static. In 1965, highway expansion resumed. Bulldozers flattened what remained of the foundation, mixing the last of the bricks into fill dirt. A small roadside marker was proposed by a local heritage group, but funding never came through. Instead, a handful of townspeople placed an unmarked stone at the site's edge. It bore no name, only the words, "Rest for the restless." By the close of the decade, modernization had erased nearly every physical trace of Bristow's rest house. Yet absence did not equal peace. Motorists traveling the new highway at night reported seeing lamplight flickering across the plain where no houses stood. A state trooper dismissed it as reflections from farm equipment, until he realized the field had none. The old story, it seemed, refused to stay buried. The land, turned and leveled for progress, still whispered beneath the engines, the same way it had beneath horse hooves nearly 70 years before. The 1970s ushered in a strange duality, science and superstition, data and folklore walking side by side. The old frontier stories, once dismissed as hearsay, now drew the attention of sociologists and anthropologists seeking to understand rural myth persistence. Among them was Dr. Miriam Cates, a researcher at the University of Tulsa, who specialized in vanished settlements of the Cimarron Territory. Cates first encountered the Bristow case through Eugene Harcrow's 1950s newspaper clippings. She wrote in her 1973 field report, "The Bristow narrative survives because it has no closure. Where evidence ends, imagination begins, and the frontier, once lawless, remains fertile ground for unfinished stories." Determined to trace the legend's factual roots, she visited Boise City, Guyman, and Beaver County courthouses. What she found was a mosaic of half-truths: missing ledgers, mislabeled property deeds, and faded testimony sheets bearing only initials. In one forgotten drawer, she discovered a single page from what appeared to be Constable Earl Danner's lost field log. It mentioned a woman's refusal, a pit behind the smokehouse, and something that ought not to have been found. Cates presented her preliminary findings at a regional conference in Amarillo. She reframed the Bristow legend as a collision of hunger, isolation, and bureaucracy, arguing that the story mirrored the psychological strain of settlement life rather than literal murder. Her balanced tone drew both praise and quiet unease. A local journalist from the Stillwater Record summarized her talk under the headline, "The Innkeeper Who Fed Her Loneliness." But not all listeners agreed. A retired highway foreman approached her afterward, introducing himself as Albert Coyle, the man who'd overseen the 1962 excavation. He confirmed that bones had been found and that someone from Stillwater had indeed removed them. "You academics talk about myths," he told her, "but the ground had proof once. It just got carried off." Cates included his statement in her next paper, but by then interest had shifted toward the sensational. A syndicated radio host broadcast a dramatized version titled Frontier Nightmare, reviving the tabloid phrase coined decades earlier. The show exaggerated every rumor, turning Eleanor Bristow into a caricature of madness, cooking stew under lightning flashes as storm winds howled. Frustrated by distortion, Cates returned to the site in 1976. The highway roared nearby, yet the soil where the inn had stood felt strangely soft under her boots. She collected a few stones, measured the ground, and wrote in her notebook, "The sound of trucks is constant, but now and then I think I hear a heavier rhythm beneath it, slow, deliberate, like something working under the earth." She never published those final notes, though colleagues recalled she spoke of a presence at the site. Within a year, she shifted her research toward migration studies and refused further interviews on the Bristow case. By the decade's end, the story once again retreated to whispers, half legend, half unresolved footnote in the margins of Oklahoma's darker history. But in every generation, someone new seemed drawn back, as though the land itself needed its memory retold to keep from vanishing altogether. The 1980s brought renewed attention to forgotten corners of American history. Across universities, graduate students began digging into local archives, tracing oral traditions, and resurrecting the overlooked. For Oklahoma, this meant a flood of renewed interest in territorial records, and inevitably, a return to Bristow's rest house. A young historian named Richard Langford, then a doctoral candidate at Oklahoma State University, rediscovered the Bristow case while reviewing statehood transition files. In 1982, he stumbled upon an unlabeled manila envelope in the basement of the Stillwater Historical Annex. Inside were carbon copies of correspondence between Dr. Wallace Keene and Clara Hensley, thought destroyed since the 1960s. Most were water-stained, some half illegible, but a few lines were clear enough to change everything. One page, dated 1937, contained Keene's typed note. "I believe the boy survived. Witness accounts suggest relocation under assumed name. Samuel may have been placed with distant kin near Fort Supply." If true, the silence was intentional. Protective or complicit, I cannot say. Langford included this quote in his dissertation draft and contacted the archives for further verification. Within weeks, the envelope disappeared from the inventory. A clerk later admitted that someone from the main office had requested its transfer for preservation, though no record of such a request could be found. Undeterred, Langford continued his research. He cross-referenced census records from 1900 to 1910, identifying a Samuel B. Rowe living near Fort Supply, a farmhand with no known parentage, matching the approximate age and scar described in Foster Bly's old affidavit. The discovery drew mild attention in academic circles, but failed to prove any direct connection. Still, the notion that the boy lived introduced a new dimension to the myth. What if silence had been survival, not shame? Meanwhile, local television stations began producing Haunted Oklahoma specials. In one 1984 segment, a news crew visited the old highway site at dusk. Their microphones caught faint tapping sounds, dismissed as interference. The cameraman swore later that the knocks came from underground. During editing, the audio file corrupted, replaced by a steady hum that technicians couldn't remove. The segment aired anyway, and viewership spiked. Langford gave a radio interview soon after, cautioning against sensationalism. He emphasized the historical framework: poverty, isolation, unregulated land, and again cited Keene's connection to the Cimarron Territory chaos. The story, he said, is not about a monster. It's about what happens when law, hunger, and loneliness meet, and no one is watching. Yet in 1987, during the digitization of territorial census microfilm, the Rowe entry vanished from the reels. Langford publicly accused the archives of tampering, but no one took responsibility. Within months he left academia, reportedly moving to New Mexico. Colleagues recalled him saying the same phrase over and over: "It's not missing, it's buried somewhere." By the end of the decade, the Bristow case had acquired a new legend: the Lost Archive, a supposed cache of Keene's remaining notes and Danner's original field log, locked away in an unknown state vault. Whether it ever existed remains uncertain, but the rumor persists, whispered among researchers and late-night archivists who claim the catalog numbers jump suspiciously from one file to the next. And so, even in the modern age of photocopies and computers, the frontier nightmare continued to slip through human hands, half history, half shadow, refusing to let the door finally close. The 1990s were supposed to be the age when every mystery could be solved with a database search. Archivists and hobby historians began uploading scanned ledgers and county records, bringing the forgotten frontier to glowing computer screens. Yet, when researchers turned their attention to Bristow's rest house, they found that the gaps had grown wider, not smaller. The Oklahoma Digital Heritage Project listed dozens of missing document series from the Cimarron Territory period, among them the very files associated with the 1896 investigation. Entire logbooks had never been microfilmed. Notes attributed to Constable Earl Danner, known through secondary quotations, appeared in none of the surviving reels. A data entry clerk remarked, "It's as if someone typed her name once, then erased it everywhere else." Still, the story endured. Online message boards dedicated to Western folklore began circulating transcriptions of Dr. Wallace Keene's lost reports. One thread titled "The Innkeeper of Mead's Fork," reconstructed files, gained thousands of views. Amateur genealogists searched for Samuel Bristow, comparing census fragments, tracing family lines, speculating that he might have changed his surname to Rowe or Bristone. Each claim ended the same way: a dead link, a corrupted page, or a record marked restricted. In 1998, a filmmaker from Oklahoma City, Daniel Price, began developing a documentary titled Frontier Nightmare: The Forgotten Case of Eleanor Bristow. He traveled through the Panhandle interviewing ranchers, teachers, and descendants of early settlers. His footage included one remarkable moment: an interview with Frank Danner, the great-grandson of the original constable. Frank produced an heirloom pocket watch, its lid engraved with the initials CD. "It came from my grandfather's box of keepsakes," he said. "He always said it belonged to one of the lost men." The production ended abruptly. Price's car was found off the service road near Mead Creek, film reels scattered in the dust. He was unharmed, but refused to speak about what he'd seen, only muttering, "It's all still there." The project was abandoned, though fragments of his footage surfaced years later online, silent shots of grass bending against the wind, and what looked like the outline of a cellar door in the dirt. Locals reported a quiet resurgence of unease. A rancher named Helen Porter, whose property bordered the old site, filed several police complaints between 2001 and 2004, claiming someone, or something, was digging at night. Officers found no footprints, only small depressions where the earth had been disturbed. One deputy joked it was wild hogs. Porter disagreed. Hogs don't dig in circles, and they don't stop when you shine a light. During a 2006 land survey, technicians noted faint subsurface irregularities under the modern highway, a void approximately 10 feet wide, extending at an angle. When asked whether it could be remnants of a cellar, the report simply stated, "Unverified anomaly." The digital era had promised clarity, yet all it delivered was amplification. Every recovered detail led to another missing piece, and the story spread further, shared in forums, podcasts, and late-night radio, where listeners debated whether the Innkeeper of Oklahoma was real, or whether the land itself had built her from its loneliness. Either way, the silence beneath Mead Creek remained undisturbed, save for the hum of passing cars, and some said, the faintest sound of a kitchen door closing when the wind turned east. By the 2010s, the story of Bristow's rest house had become a quiet obsession for a new generation of digital historians and paranormal documentarians. What had once been confined to yellowed archives and whispered legend now circulated across podcasts, Reddit threads, and academic blogs. The tale no longer belonged solely to Oklahoma. It had become part of the broader fascination with what scholars began calling the uncatalogued frontier. One of those scholars, Dr. James Lawton from the University of Central Oklahoma, began reassembling what he termed the Bristow Matrix, a comprehensive cross-reference of every name, date, and testimony linked to the case. Using scanned county ledgers, census data, and early newsprint archives, he created a digital map of disappearances in the Cimarron Territory between 1893 and 1897. The result was unsettling. Nearly every missing person was last seen within a 12-mile radius of Mead Creek. Lawton presented his findings at a 2014 symposium, noting how Dr. Wallace Keene's earlier work had predicted the same clustering pattern long before modern tools existed. Keene worked from intuition, he said. We now have data, but the story remains the same. Silence where voices should be. His presentation gained brief attention from regional media, and once again, people began visiting the site. That summer, a local drone enthusiast named Troy McKinnon flew a small quadcopter over the old highway bend. The footage showed nothing unusual until the final seconds when a flicker of light appeared in the tall grass near the supposed foundation line. It pulsed 3 times, then vanished. McKinnon claimed the battery failed immediately after. When he retrieved the drone, its underside was coated in fine red dust that seemed to cling even after cleaning. In 2017, an independent documentary team revisited the case under the title Bristow. Woman Who Fed the West. They interviewed farmers, archaeologists, and descendants of early settlers. Most shrugged off the legend, but one interview stood out. Helen Porter, then elderly and nearly blind, repeated what she had told deputies years before. It still moves out there. You can feel it when the rain starts. The ground breathes, the same as it did for her. The film was never widely released, though several still frames circulated online, one showing the field at dusk, the grass seemingly pressed down in a perfect rectangle, as though marking a buried room. Experts dismissed it as a coincidence of wind. Meanwhile, graduate students continued to search for the lost archive rumored since the 1980s. In 2020, a flood in a state storage facility near Stillwater exposed a few unmarked boxes. Inside were damp carbon copies of Keene's correspondence, including a single note referencing Cimarron Territory hearings. The paper, though half destroyed, bore one legible sentence typed in Keene's worn Remington font. The child was not a witness. He was a participant, and silence was his inheritance. Whether the line referred to Samuel Bristow or a metaphorical reflection remains unclear. Historians debated its meaning, journalists exaggerated it, and soon, social media turned it into a slogan for online true crime communities. Silence is the inheritance. By the 2020s, the land itself had changed, leveled for grazing and wind turbines, but the coordinates still match those early maps. Travelers who pulled over at night described hearing faint clanging, like pots or chains in the wind. Highway patrol dismissed it as old fencing. Others swore they saw a lantern glow where no structure stood. And once again the story of Eleanor Bristow, the innkeeper who fed the frontier and disappeared into its hunger, had found new life, half history, half haunting, and entirely unfinished. Today, the road that passes near Mead Creek carries little traffic. Most travelers speed through on their way to the Texas border, unaware that beneath the asphalt and windswept grass lies the soil where Bristow's rest house once stood. The foundations are gone, replaced by gravel and drainage pipes, yet those who know the story claim the air still changes there, just slightly colder, just slightly stiller, as if holding its breath. Modern survey drones have traced faint anomalies in the ground, rectangular patterns where no structure should be. They match the exact dimensions Professor Alton Greaves recorded back in 1902. Technology confirms what folklore long insisted. Something was built there, and something remains. But the instruments can tell nothing of what truly happened inside those walls. Historians continue to debate whether Eleanor Bristow was real or a composite drawn from the scattered accounts of the Cimarron Territory years. The Cimarron Territory itself, once a lawless stretch between competing borders, serves as the story's one undeniable truth, an empty space where oversight failed and stories like hers could live unrecorded. It's mentioned now in university lectures, in Keene's archive letters, and in the cautious essays of scholars like Dr. James Lawton, who called the case a geography of guilt. He wrote, "The innkeeper of Mead's Fork represents every forgotten frontier, where the human record ends and the land remembers in its own language. Local folklore hasn't softened with time. Truckers who cross the stretch at night say their radios fill with static between mile markers 52 and 54, the exact region where the inn once stood. Some report the smell of burnt sugar on the wind, others, a flicker of light reflected in the rearview mirror, though no cars follow. When they look again, it's gone. The small, unmarked stone placed there in 1965 St. It stands, half-sunk and weathered to gray. Every few years, someone leaves something beside it, a tin cup, a wildflower, a folded note. The county clears them away without comment. What remains of the Bristow legend sits between record and rumor, history and hunger. There is no conclusive proof, no final word. Only fragments, a burned ledger, a missing file, the faint smell of ash when the rain first hits the ground. The truth, whatever it was, seems bound to the land itself, as if the prairie refuses to release its dead. And perhaps that's fitting. Some stories were never meant to end neatly. They persist not because of evidence, but because of the silence left in their wake, the pause between what is known and what is feared. So if you ever find yourself driving through that lonely stretch of the Oklahoma Panhandle and you see a brief shimmer of light where there should be none, remember the words of Dr. Keene. The ground here knows more than any living witness. And then, keep driving.